minute because okay, we're live. Okay, perfect. Sorry, Rick. Just like a mini heart attack because like StreamYard doesn't allow you to go over for like 10 minutes without starting. It just like default not starting.
Okay. I don't think there's any need for us to have heart attacks. So like relax now, like let's get into it. So
Amazing. Well, Rick, welcome to Venture with Grace. And you're such an iconic guest. I feel like I heard about you a lot from like the SF emerging manager circle or just like the emerging LP circle. Obviously,
there's like circle for that. And iconic, strong opinions, weekly help, but very much appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's been fun to watch the show grow, over the course of the last, year or two, and see a lot of my friends on it. So now I finally get to join the club.
Okay, amazing. You're so humble, but like thank you so much for being here. So why don't we start with like the core lessons you've learned early on in your career? So like you started your career at Deloitte, and I know that like on other podcasts you've been talking about the journey into venture was kind of like very hard because back in time there was like no tech crunch, and then there's not much like resources to pivot into venture. Why don't we start with like, what were some core lessons that you've learned early on that kind of shape you into who you are today?
Yeah, I think I try to take a piece of everywhere that I've worked with, man. Like, I actually, a lot of people, don't love their years in consulting. I think my whole analyst class would have been the first, to say like, Rick's probably going to be the first person out of here. And, I ended up being one of the longest, standing people there. I was at Deloitte for 5 years. And, I think the thing that I really pulled out of that was like, one, like very intense work ethic. I graduated college before GFC. Like I was, just hitting that kind of point, 2 years in, where people are starting to think about MBAs or, going to, a private equity or venture capital firm or something else, when GFC hit. And, I can't talk about all the assignments that I worked on, but like many 100-hour plus weeks that like truly gave me appreciation for like, all right, like for work, candidly, like my family has never worked, what, we would call like a white collar job or worked at a big firm, like no one in my family. So I've been the first person to kind of experience, something like that and really didn't fully, understand what it was. But, when you're looking at your friends all being unemployed and moving back with your parents, at the age of 24, you're like, I don't want to do that. So, I think for better or worse, a lot of people who know me, like know that I have a pretty insane level of work ethic that like, I have no problem working like 70, 80 hours weeks. And, I think that's been, something that, that was hard at the time and I didn't love it at the time, but at the same time, I think that's been like a real benefit to my career, just have like an extremely high motor. I also think sticking out there for a long time and, we can talk about the hundreds of venture capital or private equity jobs that I applied for and never got, and, seeing bubbles pop like I saw happen in clean tech, which I did a tremendous amount of clean tech during like that bubble pop. So, probably stay away from any markets that I invest because GFC, climate, it's just like, it seems that bubbles popping like follow me. But, it gave me a deep appreciation for client service, which I view fundamentally what we do as venture capitalists as being consultants. Like our job is to be enablers and strategists to help, founders. And I always loved the work that I did on the consulting side. Like working at a big company was not for me, but I thought that was something that I really, really enjoyed working with clients to solve problems and, got, the chance to work on some really exciting stuff while I was there. My transition to venture capital was not easy. And I think, I've said this before and I'll say it again, like getting feedback, I remember being in a venture capital interview for like a top 10 firm, and, them saying like, hey, why would we hire Deloitte and University of Richmond, which is where I went to undergrad, when I can get McKinsey and Princeton for the same price? And, I think that really opened my eyes up to so much of the prejudice and bias that's implicit in the way that people do venture capital hiring. I think 90% plus of this industry went to Harvard or Stanford. 90% plus are people who probably like come from sources of wealth or have been like tied to, either the tech community or finance community before. I was tied to neither of those. So I found my transition and like the lack of knowledge on, how to figure out how to penetrate this world and how it, operated, what entrepreneurship looked like to be something that was incredibly opaque to me. Like, honestly, like I had a much better understanding of private equity than I did of venture capital, and venture capital was a better fit for me personally. But I found that transition to be extremely difficult. I've applied for thousands of jobs and received thousands of rejections. And I think a lot of that is just because hiring is not something that we probably do it better for our companies than we do it for our firms. And a lot of it is based on resumes. So it's become something that I'm deeply passionate about. And you can see that in the DNA that we have in our firm. We are not an Ivy League, firm in terms of most of we have people who didn't graduate college. We have people, went to, Wake Forest, University of Richmond, places like that. Muhlenberg, we just hired someone from. I believe in giving opportunity and making sure we're widening the base of, what a venture capitalist can and should look like. And I think that's really important. So we'll hopefully do a little bit of that with EMC and, which is a group that I'm involved in the emerging manager community. But I think there should be more opportunity and less prejudice and less bias in this world. So.
For sure. I love the hustle that you had early on, because I feel like the entire emerging market as a whole group is very startup as it's basically another version of your startup.
I mean,
starting
sometimes. I'll say look, the emerging manager circle now has a little over 800 founding firms in it. So people who were founders of their firms. And I'll say within that, there's a tremendous spectrum. I had to give the group a hard time the other day because I had probably about 25 people out of that group reach out. We've had I think 700 applicants for the conference that we're throwing in October, and people were asking my platform manager to fill out the 2-minute survey that they have to answer for a free conference for them to apply. And I'm most of the time those folks have an EA. For what it's worth, I don't have an EA. That's a longer, deeper conversation as to why I don't love that. But I have Midas listers who are literally filling out the application, or people who run $1 billion funds who they're hustlers. And then I have folks who have $20 million funds who or kind of are not showing that hustle, that are asking my platform manager or me to fill out the survey for them. So I think in all ways, you see that there's a spectrum, but I do find that the folks who win long-term are the folks who are, they're putting in the work. And I think, you can get lucky on one deal or two, but the folks who win long-term are the folks who put in the work.
For sure. I feel when I was younger, I interviewed 22 investors on the Midas list for my book. And I feel most of them have to hunt down their own deals. I would imagine there's a lot of inbounds. You just sit there. I mean, obviously people still have inbounds, but I think most people are still out there and then hunting instead of just waiting for the right company to come to them. So I want to start off with the first question is, why insurance? This is obviously I think I used to also work a little bit in private equity, and then a lot of the LP for funds are actually big insurance companies, and I'm aware of that it's a really profitable area, but it's also been a area that I personally feel it's one of the most traditional industries harder to be breaking in by I guess the technology is not really a thing in the industry from my understanding. Obviously I'm not an expert, but I wonder why did you decide insurance is one of the space that you focus on?
Yeah, so there's 4 markets that we focus on at Equal, and it's largely the 4 markets that I've focused my entire career on, and that's energy, insurance, retail, and supply chain. Insurance we have been particularly successful at, and I fell into that universe, really because of two reasons. One, when I was graduating Columbia and trying to rationalize how I could become a successful venture capitalist, I was not someone who, grew up technical. I am still deeply untechnical. I didn't have networks into, a lot of the traditional talent centers that you find entrepreneurs, the big tech companies or Stanford or, so forth. So it became really hard for me to figure out, okay, how am I going to be a first call for a founder, especially as someone who's starting a career? With that, I ended up joining a venture firm in Chicago called Lightbank. I never, my wife had never even been to Chicago before we started looking at apartments there. And that took a massive leap of faith. But one of the big reasons why was a hypothesis that I had on, really in, betting that could I invest in tech-enabled businesses or vertical software, really off-the-shelf technology, not taking technology risk, but doing it in some of these markets that I had exposure with, via consulting or private equity or via my network in Columbia or networks in New York or, those places that I had. And I thought that was an area that I, could show more differentiation, from, my peers, who are investing in enterprise IT companies or, really understood, consumer products, really well. And, I think that, bet turned out right. My first angel investment that I ever made, was in a company in the energy space. I spent, a huge portion of the first part of my career working in energy. And, I'm fortunate that company is now worth $3 billion. I think a lot of folks, like, they invest in the products that they think are cool. I just invest in the products that folks in my network, really resonated with. And fortunately, I knew a lot of people in the energy space, and that company Rigup has gone on to have some great success. Then the first board that I was put on was an insurance company, and one of the other board members, this guy Dennis Shakazian, who was formerly the CEO and CFO of CNA, which is a $10 billion plus insurance company. The guy is legitimately a legend of the insurance business, but like he was rough on me. I just get it, and he was like, "You're coming in here like fresh out of business school. You don't know jack shit." Like, for better or worse, that put like a pretty heavy chip on my shoulder, to say, all right, like I am going to show this guy that I know what I am talking about. So, I had no real experience as a board member at that point. My first board, I had been a venture investor, like as a intern, but never like full time, that this was really like me getting, put in the dunk tank. And I just like went and was like, I'm going to read everything that I can on insurance. I'm going to go talk to anyone, who works in this industry that will, who has a pulse that will take a phone call with me. And, I hit the street, and, Chicago, is kind of like a huge insurance town. It's really big in energy, insurance, and logistics and retail. Not a secret, not a coincidence, that like those are the markets that I focus on because I spent so much time there. But, it's the Willis Tower, Watson, three biggest, insurance brokers in the world. If you look at the skyline of Chicago, and it's just insurance building. So, with that, fortunately found a lot of, great people who were willing to connect with me, even CEOs of public companies were like, you know what, you're the first venture capitalist who's ever reached out to me. And that seemed to me very different than, the venture firm that I interned with in business school, Foundation Capital, done a tremendous amount of stuff in fintech and capital markets. Everyone in New York was trying to like break them into like, how can we sell to JP Morgan and Bank of America and Goldman Sachs and Citigroup? And meanwhile, you had a bunch of $100 billion companies. They're like, like we talk to people from McKinsey all day, and we're paying those folks $600-700 an hour to pontificate about shit that they don't understand. Meanwhile, like you're willing to come in here and like talk to us for free and like do all these research reports. And it was a really collaborative relationship that I could develop with these brokers and carriers that I think provided a lot of inside edge. So ended up earning the respect of that company and that board member, and fortunately, like making some interesting bets in insurance where one of the first deals that I did, we sold the company 7 months later for 9 figures, only having raised $3 million, dollars. And, that company was called Riskmatch. And, that was one of the kind of like, catalysts in my career that people are like, oh, maybe, a lot of people, thought that deal was pretty crazy. And, we shot up like a rocket in those 12 months. And, with that, it ended up being, a great outcome for our firm and for the founder, and something that really kind of kickstarted my career.
I wonder, so like when you're reaching out to, let's say, the public company CEOs, like, were you reaching out on LinkedIn, or like, did you like send them like a letter, or you just call them on the phone, or like, what was the strategy
like
to do it?
LinkedIn or like mutual connections? Like, I think one of the things about like a lot of folks in the industries that we work in, they're incredibly friendly, humble people. Like I love insurance because there's so many, and same thing is true in logistics and retail and energy. You see all these blue collar billionaires, and they're folks who like came from nothing, have made tremendous amounts of money, and all they want to do is do 2 things. give back to others and change the industry for the better. So we've become like pretty friendly with some of the titans of the insurance industry, and one of them is this guy who ran a $40 billion revenue company. So like we're talking about one of the biggest insurance companies in the world. And like, I will just text back and forth about like college football now. And like, root for rival teams, and he's retired now, but he's like, deeply personal and like just does it for the fun. So I think that's been, really endearing that, we've been able to bring some of these folks who, they're retired and they don't want to play. They just want to coach. And, as long as you can, show that you respect them and that, you really appreciate them and that you are well-intentioned on, doing the right thing and helping, entrepreneurs move the industry forward rather than like disrupting them, which is a word that we don't like to use. Then I think that they're willing to find ways to help out. And, I think that grows over time and those networks have become really powerful for us.
For sure. I wonder, so like you have invested in like AI for insurance operation and insurance agency and property insurance. Like, why don't we talk about like what kind of companies are popping out in the insurance space? And then what do you think could be, adding AI to it? And then what are something that you feel like should avoid at all costs?
Yeah. I mean, like, look, we're really proud of, kind of the recent batch of insurance companies we've done over, over the last 18 months. We've, been fortunate to work on 3 insurance deals, all with founders who had built billion-dollar companies before. So, we had Dan Preston, who was the former CEO of Metromile, and, he buddied up with Sam Shank, who's the CEO of Hotel Tonight, Bill Clerico, who's the CEO of WePay, Jason Mueller was the chief product officer of Policy Genius. So, like, arguably one of the most impressive teams ever assembled, let alone like an insurance, but like superstars. And that was to take an AI first approach to how you would build an insurance carrier from the ground up, like recognizing that climate was going to change the way that you look at property insurance. And for several years, we were hunting something down in that space, recognizing, all right, if we claim to be the best in insurance and the best in climate, if there's a climate insurance company that is great and we're not in it, like we're in trouble. So we spent a tremendous amount of time developing our network in that. And, I think, some of the feedback that we got from the biggest people in insurance was that like climate was going to change the way and render the existing actuarial models, that, most of insurance underwriting is driven by what's happened over the last 50 years, without an expectation of what will happen over the next 50 years. And I think really everything with AI enables a lot of real time and forward-looking simulation, that has completely changed the way that, an insurance company can operate. And SAN has been, a breakthrough success for us. It's continued to, not only get rip away traction, but, a lot of investor interest, and, they can do things that frankly, some of the biggest insurance companies in the world can't do, that I know a lot of big insurance companies are, pretty afraid of what that company might be able to do over time. So we do think that there'll be a lot of fundamental rewriting of how the insurance business operates from the carrier side. I think the same is true on the brokerage side. So, we've been fortunate to work with a lot of the biggest insurance brokers as customers via one of our other portfolio companies called Threeflow, which I think works with about like 30 to 40% of the top 100 insurance brokers in the country. Tremendously, successful company, one of our favorites in the portfolio. But, about 50,000 insurance agencies are teams of 5 or less. And so really small, long tail brokers that, really have been reticent to leverage technology, let alone AI. So these are folks that, have so many manual processes, so much waste. And because that, it's not that they're just inefficient. It means that they get worse rates from carriers. It means that a lot of money gets lost in the system. And, we've thought long and hard about how do you inject technology into this space. But one of the things that we've, progressively discovered is that most insurance brokers have very low willingness to pay for technology. So in this case, like we have taken, a different approach and partnering with a founder that we've, worked with in the past. That first angel investment I did was, largely driven by, someone that I worked with or went to business school with, Mike Whitty, who was formerly the co-founder and CEO of Rigup, which later became known as WorkRise. And, we're, partnered with him out of the gate to launch a company called Equal Parts AI, which is really about equal parts people and innovation. And, so it is, inviting insurance agencies to be part of our platform, enabling them to do the part that they love, the people part of this business, selling, working with clients. And we take everything away on the back end as part of that. And we've seen OpEx improvements of 60 to 70% in the first 90 days. And these folks become part of our P&L. As part of that. So this has become what I think is the fastest growing insurance brokerage of all time. And it's really a story that, of AI empowering these folks and providing a opportunity for them to not be part of a 5 person company that has limited generational, wealth capability, but to really be part of something that could be $100 billion company. And I think that the scope of that company is that big. And then lastly, we wanted to find an approach that was really around enabling a lot of the legacy stakeholders, particularly on the carrier side, which, I think we're talking with large insurers about, some of the redundant processes. And, I won't say which insurer, but they pointed to a building in the New York skyline and said, in that building, I have a team of 80 people that all they're doing is state filings all day, every day. And that is not exactly literally rubber stamping, data entry, all these incredibly redundant tasks that requires, a middleman and a person. And those are the types of tasks that are, fundamentally really applicable for AI. And, so we partnered with 2 founders that I've known a long time. Sean Chow, who was the co-founder, CTO of a company called Fieldglass that sold to SAP for $1 billion. And then subsequently started an RPA company called Catalytic that had a great exit. And I was an angel and seed investor in that company. And then his co-founder, I previously sold one business for over $350 million, sold another business to private equity. These were boys who had known each other in Chicago for 10 years, who have been friends for 10 years, 20 years maybe, but had never worked, with each other. And that's just been a tremendous amount of fun, walking them into all these insurance companies. And, Adam on my team has been, part of their biz dev team as part of that, but really helping, figure out how we can do enterprise AI, from, within the world's largest insurance companies. And, that company is now 6-7 months old, and already working with several of the largest insurance companies on the planet, helping them implement AI, into, their organizations, and should be a really, really fun one to watch. So, we're consistently looking for other applications of AI. We've talked about everything from, the insurance of AI, and there's a lot of movement happening there, as well as the leveraging AI to do everything from risk and compliance or attacking new verticals. And the use cases in this industry, both from a data risk mitigation and compliance perspective, are just totally limitless. It's really probably one of the industries that will be most fundamentally changed, on the back end, from AI, while still hopefully enabling, empowering a lot of those front end experiences, which are very personal and relationship driven.
I have so many questions there. One is I wonder, since you mentioned a lot of I think they're second time founders, or they already have some sort of really big exit. First of all, how do you kind of capture them? How do you kind of build a relationship with longevity? So I'm sure the relationship probably start with they were still somewhere else, and then you probably know them before they're starting a new company. So first of all, how do you start building relationship with the second time founders? And then the other part is I was I wrote down was kind of how does the money flow in the insurance industry? Because obviously I personally, I'm an insurance shopper of I'm a lemonade buyer. So I have absolutely not much clue about I'm sure the agents are making commission.
The reality is talking about the financial flows in the insurance world probably requires about a 10-hour seminar rather than a 10-second response, because the reality is it's totally dependent on every type of transaction. When you look at what happens in the employee benefits market, at the enterprise segment, and how financial flows happen across the customers that we work with at Threeflow versus, what might happen in the wholesale segment with one of our companies, Bluefield Specialty, haven't announced, but surely will, or how that operates with the direct or broker-driven channels that we do both, firsthand. It's different. So financial flows in the insurance industry are, a really complex but interesting space. And the reality is you have multiple stakeholders involved in every transaction. Like a broker needs to get paid, that broker needs to pay an agent, the carrier needs to get the payment back. So the reality is, like, a big part of the success of the legacy technology architecture has been because they control the payment rails. And if you look at the dominance of the agency management systems, which are the core systems for brokers, there's two systems predominantly applied, and Vertafore, and just handling commissions and payments is like a huge component of those businesses. And if you look at that versus like what happens on the consumer direct, to consumer lens of the way that you buy insurance from Lemonade, radically different. So
why is Lemonade like cheaper than like if I buy it from like a broker or something? And then also, like, everything is both on like based on like volunteering
insurance
information.
is never cheaper because you buy direct versus broker. Like that is actually like not the case. Brokers get paid, from the carrier, and they are not taking a markup on your product. So the reality is, like, it's their job to find you the best price that they can, the best product that they can. Now, do they always do that? No. Are there misalignments of incentives sometimes? Yes. But you don't pay more just because you went through a broker. In many ways, like the carrier prefers to do it. And what I've seen in the insurance companies that we're in that web 1.0, or like that first rise of insurance, the business that they got from including the Lemonades, Hippos, Gins, Clearcovers, so forth. They all found the business that they had going through brokers and agencies to actually be better business and a lower CAC than going direct channel. So most of those companies, if you look at it, while the hypothesis was much more an e-commerce experience, they have virtually all gone progressively, through agents and brokers, because they found the CAC and customer quality to be significantly better. So, but yeah, to go to the first part of your question regarding founders and how we've been able to attract, look, I think, when I started my venture career, it was very much like from a place of fear that I operated. And, I found a lot of needles in the haystack. And, I think a lot of the founders that I worked with were first-time founders. The first seed deal that I ever did, was in two finance guys from University of Florida that one of my mentors told me, was like, if you're going to back guys like this, you're not going to last in venture very long, because they weren't technical, they hadn't worked at startups, but they both were folks that I believed in and ran through walls. We sold that company for 9 figures about 2 years later, and now one of those founders runs Archer Aviation, which is a multi-billion-dollar public company, and the other is Brett Adcock, who runs the $40 billion figure. So that mentor of mine was very wrong in assessing the quality of those founders. But I do think, I progressively, developed more confidence in myself that, and I think the two things that I really try to, bring to a founder is, depth and authenticity. So like for us, the primary role that we can play with a founder is bringing a tremendous level of depth of understanding to the markets that they operate. So yeah, like we will introduce you to a tremendous amount of customers. We will go through and do, literally founder level work with those companies. And we can be a true thought partner because we're not, jumping into sectors that we don't know about. Like if you ask me to jump into something in healthcare, I would be useless. But like, if you want to talk P&C insurance, like I'm not bad. And Adam on my team is way better at that. And so I think, and that requires just like, we spend a tremendous amount of our time, with folks who are experts in those spaces, who are like deep relationships in those spaces, and doing research to make sure that we understand those industries cold. And I think that's something that, we call that the prepared mind. Is something that, was really initiated by Charlie Munger from Berkshire Hathaway, may he rest in peace. But Excel co-opted, and is a big believer in the concept of pair mind as well. And I think that is something that like most founders are used to seed stage investors being generalist, or like folks who can't do that, and we go deep. We go very, very, very deep to a level that maybe ad nauseum. So then I think the authenticity thing is like, look, we believe we have a very strong set of ethos around alignment with our founders. We have believe very much that like our job is to be not cheerleaders but personal trainers. We are very independent. Like we lead every single deal that we do. It's hard for me to remember, and I'm not sure if we ever have like not led the deal. So with that, we really kind of focus on how can we be the most authentic partner to a founder that we can. And in some cases, it's a founder that we've worked with in the past. That was the case with Sean and Mike, that they had each known me, close to 10 years apiece. And they had gotten the chance to kind of know what they were getting and wouldn't know what they weren't. In other cases, like, plenty of founders, Sanjeev from Texture, he was previously the co-founder of, ClassPass, or Michael from, a company that we have called Shadow Power. He had previously, been the co-founder of Sunlight, which went public, and a bunch of other companies they had sold for several $100 million. Friends with these folks, but I had never been their board member or investor. Now those are deeply close relationships. Same thing with Dan and that whole team. I think the reality is like we spend a tremendous amount of time getting to know people, and not like when they're pitching. Like, if you're pitching, it's probably too late for me to get engaged in something personally. But showing the depth of understanding and depth of passion, depth of authenticity, that like you're going to know what you're going to get with us. And if that's not the product that you want, there's Andreessen, there's First Round, there's a ton of other, like we don't compete with those firms. We try to be our own individual product, and that resonates with some founders, and it's terrifying and objectionable to others. Like we are not trying to be all things to all people.
I wonder, so like for the Figure founder, so like at the beginning, how did you kind of encounter them? So I hear about you talking about like, obviously you recognize them before, they had the pedigree or like the outcome that's like very obvious, right? But like at the beginning, like how do you kind of like come across these people, and then what gives you the conviction that they are, obviously you said like they ran through walls, but like what does that like kind of like meant when they were like, what kind of like what are like the story or like something that in your interaction with them that kind of like gave it away?
So like I'm very anti-pedigree. Again, we talked about that, and I think I've backed one Ivy League founder in the entirety of my history with both Lightbank and Equal, and that one founder bootstrapped her company for like the first like 4 or 5 years of existence, and with that, she still had that grit, chip on the shoulder. That was what we find in a lot of great entrepreneurs. I think the way that we've been successful in finding some great founders, and Threeflow is a fantastic example of that. Like all three of the founders toiled for years. They had never really worked at startups before, so they had a lot to figure out, but they had extremely deep domain knowledge. So they knew their market extremely well. They had extremely high credibility in those markets, where like you talk to other industry stakeholders and they're like, Ryan and Richard and Jeeb are amazing. Like, like best of the best. Like when, we backed Emily from Odyssey, I had done, emerging markets, international development kind of work in energy infrastructure development. And I was blown away by the amount of people that like I knew in the Africa energy infrastructure scene who like thought Emily was a superstar for a company that like 99.9999% of VCs had never even heard of. And they're like, oh, there's no way that's a seed stage company. Like, that like her network and expertise and credibility in those spaces was extremely high. I think part of how we get to conviction behind, what are someone like non-consensus founders, is like knowing the market cold. And, when we know a market, it can have like a real dialogue, with founders about those markets, and see the depth of their understanding. Like it's never a pitch. I have not taken a pitch from a founder in about a decade. And, that's a big part of like my process. Like, I don't want to be biased by your pitch or, what you're saying to a bunch of VCs who don't understand the space. I really want us to have, direct conversations and assess, the true level of your understanding, go to my network and say, hey, what do you think of this person? Because they're folks who, I've known and worked with for, a long time. And yeah, if I can introduce you to the CEO of a $10 billion insurance company or, someone at Apollo or, so forth that I trust and have known for a long time, and they come away from that conversation saying like, I really want to work with this person. They're just an absolute superstar. Like, that's a great start, and I do find, believe it or not, like folks at Apollo or a $10 billion company probably have a much greater openness to what they think a great founder is, than, folks at, OpenAI or something else like that, just because the insularity of the tech ecosystem. But, the two other things that like I really try to, look for in founders is like the self-awareness and coachability. Like, it doesn't matter where you are today, it matters where you will be tomorrow. So I'm a big believer in slope. And if you look at the slope of founders, the folks who like, you give them a point of feedback and they show, they use that and they crave that feedback as a way to make themselves better. That is someone that I know, like, if you look at where Brett and Adam were, and they were always extremely talented, extremely, hungry, but like where those two guys are today and running the companies they are versus where they were 10 years ago, like you wouldn't recognize them. And, it's because they've grown and they're so relentless in their self-improvement, perhaps more relentless than any other entrepreneurs on the planet. Like the transformation of Brett and Adam has been, one of the most enjoyable experiences in my career to watch. Those guys just absolutely take off. But then chip on shoulder. And I think like, I was with, Gordon Ritter from Emergence Capital the other day, and he was saying, great founders are always a little crazy, and I'm kind of the believer that like great founders are always like a little broken, and I think that brokenness of like something that has put that chip on their shoulder, that's what powers them at 2:00 in the morning to do the insane things and work that much more to accomplish what they have. That I find that it emotionally resonates with me, and I think that ultimately emotionally resonates with their employees and with the rest of capital markets as well. So that's what we look for. Other folks look for different things. Other folks have been very successful in looking at those things, but we love that kind of depth of knowledge and reputation in the category. Depth of grit and resiliency, to get through those hard moments, and then that coachability and slope are really the three things that I'm trying to click into.
I love that. So like when you say like coachability, does it mean like you gave me a criticism and then I'd be like, yeah, that's totally right, and then I like do something about it? About what if like the thing, like let's say an investor gave me like a criticism that like it's just like not fitting into my like my take on the issue, or like what, like how does that kind of reflect in your conversation with them?
I'll paraphrase a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and that was like, anyone who comes with a problem without a solution is just complaining. Like our job is not to complain. Like our job is to come with, bring solutions of things that we've seen that have worked, or best practices that we've seen, and use that as a way to help our founders improve. I have not operated jack shit in my life other than an investment firm. Like, like I've been a consultant and investor literally the entirety of my life. And so for me to say, hey, like criticize anyone who's in the operating chart is just wrong. Now, what I can do is benchmark across. I've been on 20 plus boards. I've been investing, for 13 years. I've worked with public companies, government agencies, and 2-person startups. So we have a lot of data points on like what has worked and what hasn't worked. We have a lot of data points on what a great founder looks like, and the things that they may do in a certain circumstance and another. So I think that is our job, is to leverage like that set of data points, which is more than what most founders are going to have, especially if you have an experience as VC, and give that to founders with a set of solutions on like, hey, this isn't working, maybe we try this, or hey, I'm seeing you do this, but other cases that I've seen this be successful, the founders were doing that. That might be something you want to try. And look, at the end of the day, it's their company. Like, and I think as much as, I would love to roll up my sleeves and sometimes, get a little frustrated that I'm like, oh man, I want to jump in the chair and do this myself. I think our job is to really supply that and like let them take the feedback. And I do find historically that our best performing founders, they see that and they're like, okay, that's interesting. Let me think about it and get back to you. And like, I'm going to implement this, because reason X, Y, Z, or like, hey, I hear your feedback, but here's the reasons why. And I'm like, actually, like, that's a very sound, reasonable, like, argument. And I think, we've seen that, I would say the thing that I've pulled out is our most successful entrepreneurs are also the ones that have the greatest self-awareness and are the most open to feedback. I'll say, I won't call out which one of the, founders that we worked to is a repeat founder who's, had $1 billion plus success, but he said, at our one of our AGMs to our LPs, in his first company, which obviously was tremendously successful, he was probably more resistant to feedback than what he is today, because he felt like he couldn't show weakness to, his investors and had to kind of show conviction, even if he didn't have it, because the venture industry, like very much was like, okay, I want to show like, what is your confidence level in this and this? And, it led him to kind of like beat his chest a lot and like, and kind of neglect that. And now having gone through that experience and, wanting to go even bigger on this next company, and he's like, I want to get as many data points and feedback, and like, ultimately the buck stops with me, but like he, will literally get mad at me. He's like, okay, Rick, what could I have done better on that? Like, every single time. And I think, our best founders, like, no one wants to be told that like they're not doing things at an A+++ level. But the best founders are the ones who are like, I know that I can always be doing something better. Rick, your job is to diagnose me and diagnose what we're doing and tell me what we can be doing better. And if you're not doing that, then you're not doing your job, which, I think like I look at Threeflow, that was a complete pivot from a SaaS to marketplace company. Like that company's at, and now it's such a smooth golf swing and, a really high performing company. Or, I look at, what we're seeing in Texture, one of our companies there, where Sanjeev, has raised hundreds of millions of dollars for his past company and, is the most critical and ruthless of himself amongst, probably any of the founders that I've worked with, ever. And, it's because of that they've achieved such tremendous momentum with the business, because it's just like, every day it's how can we get better and better and better, rather than being like, oh, I've been successful before, so I'll be successful again. So.
I wonder, so like maybe we could talk about like, how do you think about exit of some of the companies that you have backed, since I feel like they are more towards like like logistic, retail, energy, and like insurance. They're not like in the B2B SaaS space. So like, how do you think about like the exit? Are they typically just like everybody IPO, or it sounds like in the insurance company, there's
I'll let you know when I have a few more, but right now we're sitting on more TPPI than DPI, but I think the exit environment is changing very rapidly. And I think we would not invest in a company if we did not feel like it had the potential to be a, $10 billion plus public company. Everything that we do, like, and hopefully given the amount of research that we do, and like, we have, a very ardent value investing lens on like how we think about like true value creation. And, my objective with every single company we hold is to, gift the shares of those companies when I get them to carry, to my kids, because I want, the companies we invest in are theoretically like hold forever companies. That said, not every company is going to do that. And, maybe that's because they make missteps along the way, or maybe they get overvalued at one point and like, that's the time to sell. And, we got to, eventually put cash on the board for our LPs, because the M&A environment is particularly strong, or maybe, hey, those companies need to exit because there aren't any other options. And I think the interesting thing about our segment as it relates to like the buyer universe that we have is, we have a much larger buyer universe than most SaaS companies. If you're a SaaS company, you're selling to SaaS companies. companies. Like that is your buyer. Like, like it's not like if I'm building a customer service, AI platform that I'm selling that to PepsiCo. PepsiCo might be a customer, but they're not going to be an M&A buyer. And I think if you look at the concentration, particularly what's happening in tech, like the bigger companies are getting bigger and they can acquire companies, but like how many sales enablement, AI sales enablement companies are there? Like I've seen lists that include like 100, and how many can Salesforce buy? Like, and how many other CRMs are of that scale? Like that, and can they develop their own? I don't know. Like, so the buyer universe for those like is pretty slim. At the end of the day, if you're going to do that. Whereas, I think of how many insurance buyers there are. Like I was looking at the list of top 100 insurance brokers today that all do hundreds of millions of revenue. Like, and you're like, okay, like those are all $1 billion plus companies that like want to buy, and there's a good reason why they would want to buy any of our companies. Carriers, there are literally dozens and dozens and dozens of $100 billion plus, companies that need to figure out AI very, very quickly. Same thing in energy. You look at NextEra is a $150 billion company. So for them to acquire a company for $3 billion would be the volatility trading, like, in a day that like we would see, like wouldn't even think anything of, like your share price moved up or down 2%. Like that's like nothing, especially in this meme stock area. So, when you look at companies that size and scale, and candidly, I also think from a regulatory perspective, we certainly eased a little bit on FTC stuff, but you can look at like Figma and the Plaid transaction. It is hard to sell tech to tech, and I thought the blocking of both of those transactions made zero sense to me. But at the same time, I think that there is more regulatory scrutiny, and that's the reason why you see these like acqui-hire, like exchange, like things that because the fear of FTC block, because both it seems Democrats and Republicans both want to like shit on big tech, and because of that nature, I actually think it's much easier to sell companies in our environment. I mean, think of the CPG universe. Nestle's a $350 billion company. Like, let's say that they start seeing declining sales, and then they need to go and do their earnings release. All right, they could drop 7 to 10% in a day, $20 to $30 billion loss. Maybe you guys probably need to figure out AI. Like maybe you guys need to find some high growth channels. Maybe and buying one brand is not going to do that. Like you can buy as many Halo tops or whatever it is, pick whatever. That's not going to solve and make up a $20, $30 billion delta. I mean, opine on like the failure rate of M&A in that industry, but like, would you want to buy an AI-oriented platform like Starday, to help you figure that out and actually fundamentally change and have like an AI first strategy, to help you compete with Kraft Heinz and all these other players who are that big? Maybe. And so I think we'll see a tremendous amount of M&A from what we would call legacy incumbents who are customers, partners, and so forth. And we certainly spend a lot of time, with players like that. But I think there is a tremendous business case for those companies, especially given their scale, to acquire companies that are AI or digital forward, that have figured out, innovation and can go and penetrate and really take those organizations to the next level, or at least preserve, their level and, stave off disruption.
How do you find Starday, since it's in like Scottsdale? So like, how do you really like kind of like find these companies?
I want to talk about the location of that company for there's some reasons behind that. So that's always been a remote first company. So like Chaz, has been someone that we, that was one of the companies that we hatched. Chaz is someone that has been in our network for a long time. Chelsea and our team, she's now been with us, 5 whole years. But we first brought her on to help us understand the CPG landscape better prior to COVID, asking, all right, if digital grocery adoption goes up, what are going to be the second and third order impacts? I didn't want to invest in like a digital grocer like an Imperfect or a Misfit or a Newegg or any of those players. I just didn't think that was like the opportunity set for us. I don't like competing with Amazon, but we did arrive on some conclusions of where there could be pockets of new opportunity created by new forms of data, new forms of distribution, and so forth. And that really catalyzed, that process of starting that company with Jazz, doing months of research, and when we ultimately formed that company, it was during COVID. So like everyone was remote first, and for various tax reasons, it makes more sense to do that in Arizona, than it does in New York City. But everyone on the team kind of splits their time everywhere. So.
I want to so I want to be mindful of the time. I don't know if you can go over for a few minutes.
As much time as you need, Grace. Anything for you.
Okay, thank you. You're the best. Okay, so let's talk about, you have started 5 companies with founders. Like, let's talk about that. Like, what kind of company?
We actually got more than that. We've probably, as I think of, so Ali, my colleague, he interned at General Catalyst, and then I hired him at Lightbank, my prior firm, and he became, one of the co-founders of Equal when we started here. He's been part of founding a bunch of companies. So he's, been CEO of one and started and sold that in a successful exit, along the way. But he also has been part of several studios and like helping kind of do that. But we did Hatch one company, and Hatch is a term that General Catalyst, I borrow it from Joel Cutler and, Joel from General Catalyst, and the way that they do their, incubation or company creation or company formation, whatever you want to call it. They call it hatching. I think they've been about as prolific in it as anyone else out there. So, I was part of one while I was at Lightbank, and also my bosses there, started some tremendous companies. Both, Uptake got started there, and that was one of the fastest companies to a $2 billion valuation. They started Tempest while I was there. I had no involvement in either of those companies, but watching them start those companies, Tempest is a public company, right now worth, $8 to $10 billion on any given day. I thought that was a really informative experience. And then, when we didn't have capital in the early days of Equal, that company formation and kind of, leveraging a thesis and customer network that we had, proved, a good way to kind of like show momentum and like get equity into companies without having to put capital that we didn't have. And, so, in our first fund, we had, 3 companies that would categorize that, as well as a couple others that, founders coming to us like and saying, hey, we want to do something, and then being like, maybe don't do that and do this instead. I'll preserve the names of all of these companies, but I would say over the course of my career, there's probably about 10 companies that we've been involved in that like hatching or before day zero, like, of like, hey, go get yourself incorporated and I'm ready to fund you. So about half of what we do as a firm is a single line of code being written into a company, and our average check size is about $3 million that we invest, and that will continue to go up over time. We are not, we don't underwrite traction, and we really believe like big idea. We de-risk the market because we've done a ton of, research. Is this the founder that we want to bet on in a category? Whether it's our idea, whether it's their idea, we just want to be invited to the process as early as possible, because we think that's the best way to cement the relationship. And, fortunately, when we've done that, those companies have raised like, I think now it's approaching $500 million for those companies that we've been involved like that early. And, that's a really rewarding experience to be able to say like, hey, like we've literally been there since like the day of the incorporation. And to see companies go on that journey is extremely rewarding.
I have a question. So like, since like, if you guys like kind of incubate these companies, like do you guys invest as a fund too? Or like, is this a kind of like a venture studio model or?
So we believe in like, not to peanut butter ourselves across like too many like companies. Like there are folks that do that model, and I also think there are folks that want like 40-50% of the company, like, to do that. We don't believe in that either. I think the best founders don't want to do that. We leverage the General Catalyst, like, model, which is, basically like do it with incredible founders, that you would back whatever they would do, like do it on ideas that you're so passionate about that like you go start that company yourself, and do it on economics that scale with that company. And so, we treat them as standard investments. And, I think they're deals that would otherwise be extremely competitive. There are deals that, we probably get slightly better price than the open market would, because the engagement level that we have, but we don't take any preferred economics. We don't take any like additional economics on it. We target, much like all our investments, like out of our, most recent fund, we're on, fund 2, we're about halfway through. We've been averaging about 17.5% ownership across all our companies. And that includes ones that we've hatched as well as ones that we've invested in. And sometimes the companies that we hatch are actually some of our lower ownership positions because the quality of the teams are just so insanely high. That said, the second that those companies get done, like we could go and hold them up in the air and say like, and they can raise it twice the price. So, our objective is, to be in the best companies with the best founders. I'll talk about this, later on when we announce the program, but I want to spend my life working on the most exciting opportunities with the most exciting people. I think that's a good recipe for success and not just investing, but in life. And, that is truly our objective, not to put 100 bets on the field and, see which ones are working and plow into those, or to own 40% of a company that no one wants to fund and you get recapped and like becomes unfundable for that reason. We just think this is the best playbook to get into, what we think will be the category defining companies. And if you can be there to help those founders get kickstarted, when they're truly that exceptional, that's a great way, to entice some like incredible people to work on incredible ideas.
I have another question, which is like, you mentioned about like the engagement level, like how engaged are you? And then like, are you going to be like one of their co-founder level, or like, what does that kind of like entail for the engagement level to be?
We never consider ourselves co-founders. Like generally we're board members, like, of those companies. I think we budget resources on the team, like a consulting firm, like we have several former consultants on our team, like, and so, if you're a seed stage company, you're probably getting 8 to 10 hours of time from myself and our team per week, whether you're a hatch or investment, and, that is split up across obviously, so I'm on 14 boards now, so, the reality is I'm not spending 10 hours per week per company. So what we do is this 3 hats model, where it's myself, one of our generalists, and one of our product owners. A product owner or industry specialist that, we tag team that deal all together. And that way, you're getting a little bit of, my time and kind of strategy, governance, fundraising, kind of managing company building. You're getting a generalist who like is running 1 billion miles an hour, like helping on financial model recruiting, sales ops, and so forth. And they're all career VCs with 5+ years of experience. Like, Ollie's worked with me for 8-9 years, and he's just an absolute monster, like in the way that he can help companies and, really get engaged on those, or one of our industry specialists, our product owners who, can walk you into the door, help you, think about a lot of the industry dynamics. And like, we'll all work on that together. That is, we do that from the start of the deal. Like, and, when we're evaluating a company, like, hey, here's the deal team, like Rick, product owner, generalist. And, it might be that Chelsea, one of our product owners, leads the deal. It might be that Ali leads the deal. It might be that I lead the deal, but you're going to get that team. And the percentages that of like how much time we allocate, to each one of those is going to be a little bit different for each company based on who's lead and bandwidth and so forth. But we literally have, a big table of like, here's the company, here's every single one of our, myself and our employees, and how many hours per week we are supposed to budget across. And I spend probably about 30 to 40 hours of my week working on portfolio companies. That is what I enjoy. I spend the vast majority of my time doing that. Other folks on our team, maybe spend 15 to 20 hours, but I think everyone on our team, like, thinking portfolio first is like a big part of our commitment, given that kind of consulting, like, like in service mentality that we have. And I think that's like what we all, love. I was doing a walk in the park with one of my employees, earlier today. And, she was just talking about like, my favorite part of this job is getting us like close to working with the companies as I can. And I think that's very different than like, if you're at some of these other firms where it's like, I just want to get deals done, or I just want to sit on panels all day, or like I want to go like to a bunch of VC happy hours. Like I don't think anyone on our team would like ever say that, anything other than working with companies is like what we want to spend our time on. And that's the reason why it's such a heavy focus with us. So as I've looked at that, when you think about the range of our portfolio, like we are doing thousands of hours of portfolio, work per, year. And my full-time job could be just working with portfolio companies. I would be very happy if that was my full-time job. Unfortunately, I got to like run a firm and, raise money and do other things too, and occasionally look at deals. But I'd rather spend all my time working with portfolio companies.
I want to be mindful of the time. So like, quick 2 questions before we wrap. But one is, since you mentioned that, like, I think like you guys are trying to do like on average, it's like 17.5% of ownerships. I think like maybe because of like you have such a strong niche, and then the niche is not really, AI. So like I think like the valuation does not have to be like very crazy. So how do you think about like the valuation cap, and then like do you ever make exceptions, and like how do you think about like what if like these like the valuation is like crazy, but the company also seems like promising, that kind of stuff?
So we have not seen a correlation between higher price means higher quality asset. I think, there's always going to be higher payer out there. Like we are probably one of the most expensive forms of capital that you can get as a founder. I think every founder that we talk to makes a calculation in their head of like, I'm getting hundreds of hours of time, per year from a bunch of people who, would normally cost $700 to $1,000 like per hour. And I'm going to embed that into how I think about that and have a long-term position on like, what, this is the right long-term decision, not the best short-term, decision. And I think as I look at folks who have priced their seed rounds at like ridiculous prices, it puts you in such a tough spot. So yeah, we are extremely price disciplined. And our first fund, I think our average, post money was in the low teens. In this fund, it will be probably the mid teens, which, is lower than the, PitchBook median, seed valuation, despite the fact that we are working with some incredibly high caliber entrepreneurs. So I won't talk about the individual ownership positions, ownership percentages or price for any companies, but like, we, are disciplined and believe in high ownership. And I don't think that means lower quality assets. I think it means that you need to have a mutual relationship, that this is a partnership between the founders and investors. Anyone who's deciding to work with us is making a decisive decision that this is a product that they want. We don't compete in auction processes. There's always someone who's going to pay a higher price than what we can. But what we try to do is make sure that we can provide the fairest price that we can to founders, and follow that out with a tremendous level of commitment and service to them. And if you're a founder that wants that, that's great. If you're a founder that wants to auction off, like it so that you can go and like, be like, I did my seed round at a 75 cap, like, like that's not going to be us. Like, and does that mean that like we'll miss out on some great companies? 100%. But I think the reality is, if we start playing that game, we're, bigger multi-stage firms that have, both the optionality, like as well as, the ability to, the seed check doesn't matter to them, so they don't care about the price. It's really about Series B and Series C and Series D. Like when they're deploying tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in those companies, that's not where we play. So like we don't have option theory pricing baked into it. But then, secondarily to that, like it's just, not going to be a game that, we can get the ownership or be successful in the way that we want to. So our objective isn't to be in every great company. It's to build a portfolio of great companies. And, fortunately, every single one of our funds is in the top couple percentile points, I like better than top 5%, of their vintages. And, hopefully that translates from IRRs and GBPI to DPI and like money in the bank. So,
what's a, like I'll take you up on the I can ask as many as what I want question part, but like, okay, one more question to before we talk about your conference and then we wrap. So like, since like you mentioned about like you and your co-founder have worked on like companies with founders that are like turned into like billion-dollar companies, like, or like, you know, you also have invested in some of these companies that are like ultra successful, like compared to the company that having great exit versus like the like okay ones, like is there any kind of like patterns towards like the way the founder think, or like, you know, since you mentioned like you don't care about the pedigree, like what are the stuff that should be on their resume that kind of like make you feel like, you know, this guy is like gonna build something crazy, or like maybe the deal funnel slash like the sourcing strategy is probably different versus like other firms, like I guess like how do you filter out like the billion-dollar company versus like a bunch of like company that are kind of like it's probably good, but like, you know, it didn't really went out to be the best exit for the firm.
Yeah, I mean, if we thought that something was just gonna like, in terms of the way that we're sourcing and evaluating a company, like if we thought something was just gonna be a couple $100 million, actually, we wouldn't bother with it. And like that is a way to make money, but like I think we find our time scarcer than capital. And you know, so the reality is like if we're gonna make a commitment to engage in the level that we have, like there at least needs to be a pathway to that being like a massive, massive outcome. And you know, I think you know, historically, one out of every four companies that we invest in has kind of gravitated to unicorn status from when we invested at the seed. You know, it feels like that will probably be 4 or 5 unicorns out of our 15 you know, companies that we had in fund one. You know, we already have one. We're on the doorstep of having 2 others, and it feels like, you know, we have 3 other kind of shots on that have good visibility of achieving that, and we'll see which one, but like very minimum 3 will, and then, you know, it looks like maybe 4 or 5. You know, fund 2, we're already like, you know, 1 is knocking on the doorstep of, you know, being a unicorn, and, you know, that fund is 18 months old. So, you know, you know, or actually now approaching 2 years. So, you know, I think we have a good progression rate on that, but like we are swing big believers. And I think that's actually more risky to swing small. So like, you know, from the onset, like, it's go big or go home. Like it is our mentality, you know, especially because we're playing in niche markets. Like it, you know, we're not going after foundational models here, but like you got to be that, like they're going to be the category owner for something. So we focus ardently on like, okay, can this be a generational founder? Is there a flywheel? Is there a moat? Like, you know, and, you know, we're very dogmatic about that. The companies that make it and the companies that don't are really defined by, you know, 3 things. Like, you know, did they actually achieve like a real flywheel and moat around the business? Like, you know, did the founder have incredible slope, you know, or did they just kind of like, you know, achieve homeostasis and like plateau, you know? And 3, the exit environment. You know, I think the best companies, you know, never sell. Good companies are, you know, bought, not sold, and bad companies, you know, sell. And so, you know, the reality is, you know, our mission is to never sell. Like if we're in a company that's truly fantastic, like I want to own it forever. And yeah, like we'll distribute shares to, you know, to our LPs and so forth. You know, and then, you know, we make very rationally minded decisions on like what we're going to take secondary for the next set of companies. And we talk about, you know, risk management and how we think about, you know, making sure we're putting points on the board and so forth. And that, you know, but, you know, I think you got to be cognizant of the M&A environment where it's, you know, in 2021, you know, you had SaaS multiples like that were bonkers, like we're achieving somewhat similar in the AI race right now. That there's a lot of rational pricing in there. The PE Schiller index is at the highest that it's ever been. You know, so like, you know, prices are getting pretty beefy, and you know, I think that might create some interesting selling opportunities. You know, and you know, we'll see if we can take advantage of that. That said, you know, it's really, you know, you got to time that, and I think. There are plenty of companies. I was talking to some of the other day. They're like, man, like we thought that company was going to die, and then like 9 months later, the market improved. And we sold that company for $600 million. At the same time, there's plenty of other folks who are like, hey, I'm in this $10 million unicorn, and then the company kind of like crashed. It was overvalued. Now like they can't get rounds done, and now they're getting crammed down from investors, and you know that 250x markup that you had is all of a sudden like you're getting your preference back. And, you know, that is killer if you're a seed fund. So I think knowing when to sell is probably like the most underrated skill set in venture capital. And it's not one that I can claim to be particularly good at. I'm hoping that I can be very good at it, but it's something that like we're still very much like learning and improving. So
what is your like diligence process to the founders to lead something? Just because like, as a small angel investor, a lot of it's kind of like a vibe check, or just like, oh, I feel like this generational founder / they're amazing at sales, right? Like, so I wonder, how do you like, what is like one question that you would ask a founder? And then what does your like diligence process look like? How many people do you have to chat with to like get comfortable? And what kind of questions do you ask? Like typically, like, because of like I live in a SaaS land, so like everyone, obviously you don't live in a SaaS land, you're like the opposite of, I guess, Jason Lumpkin, as we before the show we chat about this. But like I feel like a lot of in the SaaS arena, like literally, like, you would ask like 5 people, they have 5 different ideas about this company, or like especially if someone's like building something that's selling to the engineers, like the engineers don't want to buy anything. So like whenever I ask like, hey, would you use like this, I don't know, like QA testing platform that's AI, and then they're like, no. So like basically I wonder, how do you think about like the vetting process for these companies to like lead something?
So there's no formula to this, because I think every founder is different, every opportunity is different, and every process has to be different, to adhere to that. That said, I do think that there's a couple things that we look at that are consistent across those. So like one, if you look at the average duration of our process, it is months, not days. Like, again, if you have a deck, it's probably too late for us. And a big part of that, we're not religious about that, but like the reality is like we like to get to know folks. So, I think the most recent investment we've done that we did, myself and several members of the team have known the CEO for probably 5-6 years. Now, the company is like brand spanking new, but we've known that person for a long time. We're like, this guy is really good, and we think he's going to do something special. So like when he's ready, let's do it. I was texting right before this with someone who sold their last company for $1 billion, and like we spent the last 6 months like tossing back and forth ideas, and like if we can find something to sell on, I'm like, I think this person is a superstar. Like we need to work with them. And in other cases, like in the case of Ryan and Richard and Sheehy from Threeflow, like that was a 6 months courting process of like me like showing them, doing homework, and ultimately investing in the company for people who are extremely extremely talented. That company's been extremely successful. They're amongst the best founders that I've ever worked with in my life. Same thing with Brett and Adam. I had known those guys for like a year or two, seen them evolve, and seen the slope, and that's how getting to know folks when they're not raising, which is I'm kind of at distance and against like the way that like Silicon Valley and that kind of auction process of like go meet 50 investors and like figure out like that is often what we need to do for Series A's and Series B's for our companies, because this is the most efficient way to do it. But I think given our entry point, like the best relationships we have, are the ones where like we're getting to know folks for a very long time. Sometimes it's months, sometimes it's years, sometimes it's a decade. And I think, with that puts us in the position. Now that's not always the case. In the case where like, we need to, get there faster, we rely on our bridger networks. And, one of our kind of core, adages that we have is bridge the digital divide. Like, we are the gap between, the incumbents and the innovators, and we want to bring those two universes together. And our bridgers are, those folks who are within our industry verticals who like, they get that. They get the innovators mindset, but they, know the industry gold. And, so there are folks that like, I would never tap into like an expert network of someone who doesn't understand us, doesn't understand our process, doesn't understand, and click into what we have. And what we've seen is that some of those folks, over time are like, this person's a superstar. Like, this is exactly like, what we need to. And they're all folks who are either investors in our fund, advisors of our companies, folks that I've known for a very long time that I trust their judgment and have been able to see, what is the quality of their assessment of, those entrepreneurs and other folks, over time, and their willingness to help. So, if someone who's the CEO of an insurance company, or, runs a big 3PL, or, is, a big time person, founder, that runs a unicorn company, in the climate space, who, these are all folks that, known a really long time, and they, say, hey, like, not only is like that person awesome, but like I want to be a customer partner, design partner, whatever it is, that company, and I want to invest. Like, that's a pretty bullish signal. So I'd rather take that than the cool, the reference that someone gives me, because those references are all going to be hollow in their own way. Like, I can't. Some of the biggest mistakes that I've had in assessing people have been taking those references from folks who like know how to, because they worked at Google or Uber, like they just, it feels like there's a master class at HBS on like how to give references to your classmates. And I'd rather rely on the third party assessment, or kind of talk to folks who know them in the industry and say like, oh, I talked to my friend at Sun Life and they said like Ryan and Richard were transformational, that those folks were like, that those guys were just absolutely like the 0.1 percenters of that company. And I think that's how you can get past that, like, hey, I'm relying on the crutch of a pedigree or something else, like, and that I just find like there's plenty of dumb people who go to those schools too. There's plenty of people who are bad at their jobs. Like, why are we relying on like the fact that someone had a good SAT score to determine whether like they'd be a good founder, years later? So, that's us. Our process, we've done deals in as little as, like 5 days, and we've had ones where like it feels like it's been 5 years in the making.
I love that. Last question before the conference. I promise this will be the last. What about like, do you have like a frequency that you have to deploy? So like, for example, obviously you guys are like higher concentration than other companies, because I assume you are like higher concentration, and if like 17,
we're about 15 companies per fund.
Okay, that's like very high concentration in my opinion.
Other than like K9 Ventures Fund 1, like I have not found a seed stage fund that has a higher level of concentration.
Yeah, I think the average is like 28 to 32, something like that. So
that's like about right. Yeah. So I think we think of ourselves as like a little bit more of a Series A firm, like that's masquerading at seed. So like, and historically about like 80-90% of our companies making Series A, and it's like 70-80% of the companies making the Series B. So we feel like we can run a higher level of concentration than other firms because we de-risk the market and we're able to positive select for founder quality and so forth. And for that reason, I just don't believe in diversification. Like, one of our core principles is, conviction favors concentration over diversification. And so, yes, we have a pace that we like to hit, but we are extremely patient. So I think most fund managers do like 2-year investment cycles. Ours are 3 to 4. We do 4 to 5 deals a year. I wouldn't mind it if we picked up the pace there, but like, I think, the reality is if we never feel pressure to put money to work. All our LPs are very long-term oriented. 95% of our LP base are endowments, foundations, fund of funds that, want to be in the returns business, not in the deployment business. And, so, we're very focused on like making sure that we are not lowering the bar just to get deals done. So, we want to be in the exceptional. And, if that means that we do 3 deals in a year as a seed firm, like only 3 deals, we've done that. And, because we feel prices are high and so forth, but, we're going to strike when we think that there's, incredible opportunities. And, we're fortunate to have like a really amazing set of LPs around the table that, again, our approach is not for everyone. Like, we are not the best product for every single seed stage founder, and we're not the best product for every LP out there. But, we think that, we have some LPs that, have deep conviction in our approach, and like the fact that it's different, like the fact that it's a little slower, like the fact that it's more concentrated. They're getting diversification in a bunch of other ways. And, that's been great relationships. I consider the relationships that we have with some of our LPs to be some of the closest relationships that I have in my life, because like I can come to them with a thought process, get feedback on something and say, hey, I want to do something different than the way that other seed firms, like, am I crazy? And they're like, yeah, but like, let's do it. Like, so, they're willing to tolerate, a little bit of our craziness. So
I want to highlight your submit for a little bit. So like you started this when you were like an emerging manager. At the beginning there was like only like 8 like emerging manager or something, and then now like the mighty listers cry at the summit. Like how do you think about like you know like the I guess like what is your goal for like the summit, and then obviously like um what are some like takeaways like for running them?
Yeah. And so for those who are unfamiliar, like I founded a group called the Emerging Manager Circle back when I started the firm. I had, not had the mentorship that, I would have liked, from more senior members of the industry. I had really no clue what I was doing when it came to like starting a fund. And, while there were resources like Kaufman out there, I could not afford them. And I think Kaufman's an excellent institution, and I love what they've done with the program, particularly in recent years. But like, it was not financially accessible to me. And so, with that, I got together a group of a couple other emerging managers who were going through the same, trials and tribulations. I was, made it confidential, safe space that we could actually like be like really authentic and vulnerable with each other. And, that was before COVID, before we were getting fun up, and, over COVID, I think a lot of us were going through a really tough time. We had to figure out a lot of things, especially like investing and managing teams, like figuring out LPs, like we were worried that LPs were. So the group kind of exploded, over the, year or so of like lockdowns, and, now it's 800 plus members. But shortly after COVID, I just found myself really wanting to get together with that group and show a deep level of appreciation for them. While we had done a lot of stuff virtually, together during that time frame, got together, in the summit, and, sold out very quickly. Like half GPs, half LPs, and, guys like Fred Wilson and Joe Cutler, like sharing their stories and like, getting very emotional, and it was awesome. And so it's one of my favorite events of the year, and we're fortunate to have, some long entrenched partners like SVB, who have been great in helping us, bring this group together. And each year it gets a little bit bigger. Now, I think one of the reasons why we do this is, again, like I think there's a lot wrong in the venture industry. I think there's a lot of things that like, a lot of nepotism, a lot of bias, a lot of things that like, impede, progress for industry, both in founders as well as, what happens, in the actual managers getting funded. And I believe, the best thing that we can do, for this industry, but, broader society, is make sure that there's economic mobility and there's economic opportunity. And I think for that, when I was raising our fund, talking to, other GPs being like, why would I give you my LP connections? Like, why would I enable a competitor? Like literally, like, that was something that folks would say, meanwhile, like if you went to the right country clubs or, so forth, like, oh, I've known that LP, since I was 5 years old. Like, it's amazing how often that happens in venture. So I wanted to break down that a little bit. And, I think that was a great way in kind of creating a room that I think looks like, our team hand selects every single GP in there. I select the LPs. But creating a room that we think is aspirationally what we think the venture industry should look more like, more diverse, more equitable, like, like, hey, like, let's do this not based on like who's in the cool kids club, but like, revealed results, not, and, who's contributing to others. Like, we have 700 people in our Slack, and I'm like, I see like who's helping out others, in the group. And like, those are the folks that I want to see as the future of our industry and help where we can. Secondarily to that, it's just an incredible opportunity to learn. And, one of the things that we do is like everything that we do is confidential, but, we've having speakers like, Roger Ehrenberg, Mamoon Hamid, Mike Maples, Annie Lamont, Gordon Ritter. This year we'll have Gary Tan, Jeff Horing, Teresa, and Lauren from A Crew, which will be a fascinating conversation. David Thurston, who's one of the co-founders and head of research at Cambridge Associates. We've had some of the most incredible LPs as well as some of the most incredible GPs, all with a very wide range of topics. I just learned so damn much from those folks that like. I love that. And yeah, like to see folks show some vulnerability, like to have, as you mentioned, we've had a Midas Lister cry on stage every year, and like it's because it's a safe space. And I think creating a safe space in our industry like feels pretty rare, and I derive a lot of fulfillment from seeing folks go to that place, and hopefully everyone who comes and participates in anything that we do is that leaves a better person. And is there a business case for that in our fund? Hell no. Like time on it. I think the biggest business case that we have is like, we learn a lot, and I really enjoy it. Like everyone has their own nonprofit causes that they work on. This is kind of ours that like we think it's the right thing to do for the industry, and it doesn't tie to business case outcome. We do it for free, and I think by not monetizing and not making it something commercial, like it enables us to really just focus on like having the highest quality people in the room that we can, and having it like aligned to like what the mission that we want to accomplish is, rather than making it something that like, oh man, like I got to maximize the EBITDA on this, which I'll save my EBITDA maximization for other endeavors. So,
what are like how do you, I guess, like what do you guys talk about in the Slack group? And then like for the 800 people, like what is a cadence to like chat with people? And then since you mentioned about like, some people are like less willing to contribute their own like LP to the group or like to the like conference, but since you have like half of them are like LPs, like how do you kind of like incentivize them to kind of like share, or like do you pull from like just your own?
Well, our EMC community is exclusively GPs, so you have to be a firm to be part of it. And I think creating a safe space, like in a culture around that and a community around that, like it takes a lot of time. And but like people will ask things that are like incredibly mundane of like, hey, like I need, what should I be paying XYZ for, fund formation or for like, fund admin, and like, can anyone put me in touch with someone for a QSBS or, or hey, I need advice on CRMs, and, see all that stuff that's probably, like should be on 10,000 forums and so forth. But like, the information changes so fast that getting perspectives and then finding someone that you can hop on the phone and be like, oh wait, I know that person. Like they run a fund that looks like mine. Like, we, recently recruited like an outsourced CFO, advisor to our fund, and like, going through and getting feedback on like, hey, we worked with that one, like they sucked, like, these folks, and like everyone piling on it, has been helpful. To a more complex, hey, like I'm dealing with burnout. Can like, like what are strategies that, or like, hey, I have an issue, like an HR issue with one of my employees, like, can anyone hop on the phone and talk, with me? Or, hey, here's some deals that we have. Or, hey, I just closed my fund, but like this LP is really looking to increase their exposure. They want to know like, other folks who might be a fit. Like if anyone's interested, like, send me your email, like, and I'll give them so that they can parse through it. We've done reverse pitches every month, which is basically like we have 3 LPs, pitch the group. So we'll have a couple hundred GPs, like, on a Zoom, with, a big endowment or a fund, they're used to being the ones taking pitches, and like, they're like, okay, here's the reason why you should take our money. And then we set up a survey, to, basically, say, hey, like give some of your information. We're not going to look at it, to, this LP, and like, they're going to reach out, and a couple $100 million has been like found its way, through those connections. So I think that's been, really, helpful. And, the fact that like we're giving other people give, and, the fact that there are events like the EMC summit, like, in that we let people know like, hey, you abandon in the group if you like, you talk about anything that we say here that's like private and confidential outward. So like safe space, but then like, hey, like we very much take note of like who's helping others, so, just today I had one of the folks text me and was like, hey, how can I help out with like this happy hour that like, you're doing? I was like, I'm not controlling the GP list, but like, we appreciate your help. And others who are like over the entire course of the year, like, hey, here's this LP, or here's this event that I'm doing, or like, I'm hosting a dinner with like the head of this endowment, like who wants to come? And you just see people give. And I think when everyone realizes that, like, we're not competing against each other, like the aggregate value of our entire group is like we collectively raised like, maybe call it $20 billion. That's like basically what GC and Andreessen have raised in the last so like we're not competing against each other, like, and if you find ways to help one another, like people are going to help you back. And I think that's like the trust fall that we all take, and some folks take advantage of it. They don't last very long in the group. Some folks really opt in and help out. And then when it comes to the summit, like it's deeply personal topics, like had everything from people talking about firm breakups and partners that they've had to get rid of, and really complicated hey, our firm almost died because of XYZ, to hey, like talking about patterns of abuse from their parents and so forth, and how that's informed them as an investor, to the biggest fuck ups that they've made, to the biggest success stories. And I just think like when you can have those conversations in a room of people who are like every single top and down and foundation fund of funds is in that room, and they're seeing people operate differently. And because I believe in like neutralizing that power dynamic, like you go to most GPLP conferences and it's like the ratio is pretty far off. And you just see like the head of endowment like slammed up against a wall with like surrounded by $10 million funds, like, and we construct a audience that is never the case. So I think communities are really hard to develop, but I believe really strongly in them. And like we've subsequently taken that format of like invite only, intimate, free, but like really high quality, and finding balance between different stakeholders, and taking that when we start doing with each one of our verticals. So like we have our climate capital summit coming up. Like last year we had $1 trillion of capital on stage, $1 trillion, a T. Like, and with that, when you have that with founders and investors and politicians and so forth, all in a room where it feels intimate still, like that's pretty cool. And that's been one of my favorites. We did that in insurance, and everything from the head of a $60 billion insurance private equity firm to people who run 20, 30, $40 billion companies, to startup founders who are like 2 years into it, all in one room, where like I'm like watching a guy who's like the head of a $60 billion insurance private equity firm, like they're just like hanging out all day, like, and enjoying it. He's like, oh man, this is fun. Like, and that's normally like not what you would think of or expect for someone of that caliber. So I think that's like a really great way to break the disinformation, because even in the GPLP world, like emerging managers have a perception of what LPs are like, and LPs have a perception of what that emerging manager is like. And if you can just be more honest, open, and authentic, like I think we'd probably make a lot less mistakes, and waste a lot less time. So.
Wow, I love that. Okay, so I want to end with like a 30-second fire round for you, though I like thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I'm like trying to not go over like too long. Okay, so what's your favorite book?
Man, that's a tricky one. There's so many influences. So I think my favorite book that I suggest everyone reads is, I call it my business Bible, is Competition Demystified by Bruce Greenwald. I think it has been the centerpiece of like my investment framework, but the book that changed my life the most would either have to be Jerry Colonna's Reboot, which was one of the things that inspired the EMC group, or Carlotta Perez's Technology Revolutions of Financial Capital, which was ultimately like the thesis for our fund.
Wow. Who made the biggest impact in your career?
My wife. First investor, and we've been together since we were 22. I think of like when I was a consultant and like trying to figure out my shit, I think like anyone who knows me before I was 22 and where I am now, they can see a tremendous amount of like hopefully growth. But a lot of that is because I've had a good coach along the way.
Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Who would I invite to a dinner party? Does it have to be a venture person, or can I pick someone cooler?
Oh, you can pick whoever. It's your
Aaron
party.
Aaron Judge and Bill Murray. I would love to, I'm a big baseball fan, and I'm a big 80s like comedy fan. So like, if I could get those two guys in a room, with a steak and a bourbon, that sounds like a pretty cool evening.
Wait, is Groundhog Day by Bill Murray, or am I crazy? Yeah. Oh yeah, I love Groundhog Day. That was like a very interesting.
Stripes fan, but yeah.
So, love that. Where can we find you outside of work?
Outside of work, I probably spend about 99% of my time either like sleeping with my kids or so like, I'm at the stage with a 3 and 6 year old, like I don't have much of a personal life. So like, very often I will be running around Brooklyn Heights with my kids at a playground or taking them to a baseball game. We go to a lot of baseball games during the summertime, otherwise like I'm at the office working. So, that works. So.
Love that. Well, Rick, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was such a fun conversation, and it was like such a master class for building a fund, portfolio construction, or like just working with the founders.
I don't think there's any master class here. Like we're figuring it out like everyone else, but I think, the reality is if, hopefully some of the mistakes that we've made, folks can learn from them. And I think that, hopefully it makes it a little bit easier for others. And hopefully, there's more learning to come. So thank you for all you do. I've learned a lot from these sessions that you've done with others, and hopefully this is helpful. And if there's any way that I can be helpful, let me know. Okay.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Let me quickly end